wind had teeth and it was chewing on the world. It swept across the high plains of Wyoming with a noise like a blade being sharpened on stone, scouring the last of the autumn grass from the frozen earth and piling snow into drifts that looked like bleached bones. For 3 days, it had not stopped. For 3 days. The sky had been a low, bruised ceiling of gray, and the sun was nothing more than a rumor. Eli Morgan bent his head, pulling the brim of his hat down to shield his face. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, plodded onward, its breath pluming in the bitter air. The cold was a physical thing, a weight that settled deep in a man's marrow. Eli was used to it. He was used to the silence, the emptiness, the feeling of being the only living soul in a land that was either not yet born or long since dead. He was 34 years old, but the solitude and the sun had carved a decade more into the lines around his eyes. He rode alone because he preferred it, and because the world had a habit of taking things from him when he got too close. He had made a name for himself, though he never sought one. They said Eli Morgan had a righteous heart and a fast hand, a combination that kept him employed and isolated. Ranchers hired him to track rustlers. Traveling families paid for his shadow on dangerous roads. Widows, left with nothing but a deed and a prayer, knew he would stand between them and the men who saw opportunity in their grief. He did not do it for the money. Not really. He did it because he knew what it was to see the wolves win. He had seen it once, and that was enough for a lifetime. It was the smoke that caught his eye, a thread of gray so thin it was almost invisible against the gray sky. It rose from a small hollow, sheltered by a cluster of skeletal cottonwoods. No sensible traveler would be making camp in a place like this, not in this weather. It was either a fool or someone in trouble. Eli's hand rested for a moment on the worn stock of the rifle in his scabbard before he nudged Gideon forward. He was a man who approached the world with caution, but he never turned his back on it. The campfire was little more than a pile of glowing embers, gasping their last against the wind, and beside it, huddled on the frozen ground, was a woman. She was wrapped in a shawl so torn it looked like a spider's web, the fabric offering no real protection from the cold. Her hair, a dark river of brown, was matted and wild, dusted with snow, but it was her feet that made Eli's gut clench. They were bare, stark white against the gray. Dirty snow, the skin cracked and bleeding. He dismounted slowly, his movements calm and deliberate so as not to spook her. She did not look up until he was a few feet away. When she did, her eyes were the most haunted things he had ever seen. They were wide and dark, sunk deep in a pale, bruised face. They held a kind of emptiness that went beyond hunger or exhaustion. It was the look of a soul that had been hollowed out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough from the cold, "you'll freeze to death out here." She stared at him, her gaze unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, only a bone-deep weariness and a flicker of something hard and defiant, like the last coal in the dying fire. Her hands were clenched in the thin shawl, and he could see the knuckles were raw and scraped, the skin around her wrists dark with old bruises. He took a step closer. "I have a cabin, not far. There's a fire and food." She watched his mouth as he spoke, but her expression did not change. Her lips, blue with cold, parted slightly. Her voice was a bare whisper, a dry rustle of leaves. "Are you a good man?" The question caught him off guard. It was not what people asked in the wild. They asked if you had a spare bullet, a sip of whiskey, a bit of salt pork. They did not ask about the state of your soul. "I try to be," he answered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. She considered this for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a crack in his foundation. He stood still, letting her look. He had nothing to hide, but he had plenty he did not wish to show. He shed his heavy sheepskin coat, the cold biting at him instantly through his woolen shirt. He held it out to her. "Here." She flinched as he moved. A small, sharp movement, like a rabbit sensing a hawk's shadow. Her eyes darted to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. She did not move to take the coat. She simply stared, her body racked by a shiver so violent it seemed it might shake her apart. "I won't touch you," he said softly, understanding her fear. He laid the coat on the ground between them. "Take it, please." Her gaze fell to the coat, then rose again to meet his. She finally spoke again, her voice still a thread of sound, but clear and strange. "You can warm me," she said, her teeth chattering. "Just not with words." Eli nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between them. He understood. Words were cheap. Words could be lies. He had learned that lesson in a dusty courtroom a long time ago. He stepped back, giving her space, and turned his attention to his horse, loosening the saddle, pretending to be occupied. He heard the rustle of the heavy coat behind him, and when he glanced back, she was struggling to pull it around her shoulders, her movement stiff and clumsy. The coat swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging far past her bruised hands. She did not thank him. She did not need to. The cabin was less than a mile away, tucked into a fold in the hills, shielded from the worst of the wind. It was a simple, one-room affair he had built himself for hunting season, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, and a built-in bunk. It was shelter. It was enough. He got a fire going, the dry pine catching quickly, and soon the small space was filled with a growing warmth and the clean, sharp scent of wood smoke. The woman sat on a stool by the hearth, as close to the flames as she could get, the coat still wrapped around her like a fortress. She had not spoken another word since the campfire. Eli moved about the cabin, his motions economical and quiet. He made coffee, the smell rich and dark, and heated a can of beans. He set a tin plate and a mug on the floor beside her, then retreated to the other side of the room to eat his own portion, giving her the illusion of being alone. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She ate slowly at first, then with a desperate, hidden hunger, her eyes never leaving the fire. She was a ghost, a specter the winter had spat out. Who was she? Where had she come from? Questions crowded his mind, but he pushed them away. He had given his silent word. He would not press her. He would let the warmth and the quiet do their work. Later, when the fire had burned down to a steady, pulsing glow, he laid out his spare bedroll for her near the hearth. "You can take the bunk," he offered. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. She preferred the floor, closer to the flames, closer to an escape route if she needed one. He understood that, too. He took the bunk himself, lying down fully clothed, his gun belt hanging from a peg on the wall, close enough to reach. He did not expect to sleep. He lay on his back, staring up at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, and listened to the two sounds that filled the night, the howl of the wind outside and the soft, steady breathing of the stranger by his fire. The darkness was a familiar companion. It was in the dark that the memories came for him, unbidden and sharp as glass. They always started the same way. The sun, hot and merciless on the back of his neck, the smell of dust and dry grass, the lowing of cattle, and the sound of his brother's laugh. Samuel. He had been 5 years younger, with a smile that could charm a snake and a heart that believed in the goodness of people. Eli had always been the quiet one, the watcher, while Samuel was the talker, the dreamer. They had inherited a good piece of land from their father, with a creek that ran year-round. It was enough to build a life on. But their neighbor, Jedediah Thorne, a man whose greed was as vast and empty as the plains, said the creek was his. The dispute had started with fences being cut and threats muttered in town. Eli had wanted to handle it his way, with quiet intimidation and a clear show of force. But Samuel, ever the optimist, believed in the law. He believed in reason. He had ridden out to talk to Thorne, to show him the survey map one last time. convinced that a decent conversation could settle anything. Eli found him 3 hours later. He was lying beside the creek, the clear water running pink around him. The survey map was crumpled in his hand. Thorne had not used a gun. He had used a shovel. It was brutal and personal and ugly. Thorne had not even bothered to run. He stood on his porch, watching Eli carry his brother's body home, a smirk on his face. He knew how things worked. He had money. He had influence. The sheriff was in his pocket, and the judge was a distant cousin. The trial was a farce. Thorne claimed Samuel had attacked him, that it was self-defense. Witnesses were paid to lie. Evidence was lost. The judge spoke of regrettable passions and unfortunate misunderstandings. Jedediah Thorne walked out of the courtroom, a free man. That was the day Eli Morgan stopped believing in words. He stopped believing in lawmen and judges and the kind of justice that could be bought and sold. He had wanted to kill Thorne. The rage was a fire in his gut so hot he thought it would consume him. But as he looked at his mother's shattered face, he knew he could not leave her alone, could not become the monster Thorne had been. So he buried his brother, sold the land he could no longer bear to look at, and he rode away. He had been riding ever since, a solitary man looking for a justice that could not be found in a courtroom, a justice that was about protecting the Samuels of the world from the Thornes. A sound from across the room pulled him from the past, a small, choked gasp. He turned his head slightly. The woman was sitting up in her bedroll, her back ramrod straight. In the dim firelight, he could see her face was tight with terror, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. Her hands were pressed against her ears, as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. She was lost in a nightmare, her body in his cabin but her mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and terrible. "Anna!" The name was a scream trapped in her memory. He heard it, clear as day, a man's voice, raw with anger. "Anna, you get back here!" She flinched, curling into herself, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Eli's muscles tensed. Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer comfort, to say something, but he remembered her words at the fire, her flinch at his touch. He remembered his promise. So he stayed in the bunk, his heart aching with a shared, unspoken understanding of what it was to be haunted. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing, pretending to be asleep. He gave her the dignity of facing her demons alone, here in the warm silence of his cabin. After a long while, he heard her lie back down, and the cabin was quiet once more, save for the wind. The next morning, he rode into Jericho Springs. The town was little more than a muddy street with a dozen wooden buildings leaning against each other for support. It was a place for trappers, miners, and cowboys to spend their money on cheap whiskey and bad company. He needed flour, coffee, and cartridges. He left the woman at the cabin, with his rifle and a pile of firewood. She had watched him go from the doorway, her expression unreadable. He did not know if he would find her there when he got back, but he left the door unlatched all the same. In the general store, while he waited for the proprietor to weigh out the flour, he listened to the town gossip. 2 ranchers were arguing over a stray bull. A new preacher was coming in on the next stagecoach, and a deacon from a town further east had gotten himself into a spot of trouble. "They say the preacher's wife ran off with him," a man with a tobacco-stained beard said, spitting a brown stream into a nearby bucket. "That ain't the story I heard," another man chimed in. "I heard she tried to seduce the deacon, and when he turned her down, she got hysterical, claimed her husband was a brute." "The husband's dead, ain't he?" the store owner asked, scooping coffee beans into a sack. "Caught in a fire at the parsonage, I believe." "That's right, and she's the one who said it, is the rumor. Fled before they could question her. A real Jezebel, that one. A widow named Whitley." Eli paid for his supplies, his face a neutral mask. He did not react, did not ask questions, but the name echoed in his mind. Anna, the name she had heard in her nightmare. He loaded his supplies onto Gideon, his thoughts churning, a preacher's widow, accused of terrible things, running for her life. It fit. It fit the bruises, the fear in her eyes, the desperation that had led her barefoot into a blizzard. He knew the way townsfolk twisted stories, the way they condemned a person, especially a woman, on whispers and prejudice. He knew that the truth was often the first casualty in a storm of gossip. When he returned to the cabin, smoke was curling from the chimney, and she was sitting by the fire, just as he had left her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately checking to see if he was alone. A flicker of relief crossed her face when she saw that he was. He did not mention what he had heard in town. He just unpacked the supplies, setting the fresh flour and coffee on the shelf. The silence stretched between them, no longer tense, but settled, companionable. That evening, she spoke. "I lost my husband," she said to the fire, her voice low. He stopped what he was doing and listened. "There was a bad situation. I had to run." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "I have nowhere to go, no one." It was not a confession, but it was an offering. A small, broken piece of her story, given in trust. "You're safe here," he said, his own voice quiet. "For as long as you need." She finally looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or defiance in her eyes. It was a fragile, hesitant gratitude. They stayed in the cabin for another week as the storm blew itself out. They fell into a simple routine, a life measured by the splitting of wood, the brewing of coffee, the quiet passing of hours. He never asked her name, and she never offered it. She was just the woman, and he was just the man who had found her. It was enough. But the world did not stop turning, and his obligations lay elsewhere. He had a job waiting for him, a ranch to the south that needed a steady hand to watch over its herd. The day came when the sky cleared, and the sun shone bright on a world buried in white. It was time to move on. He packed his saddlebags in the morning light, the cabin feeling unnervingly empty already. She watched him from her stool by the hearth, her silence a heavy weight in the air. He did not know what to say. He could not leave her here to fend for herself, but he could not force her to come. He finished his packing and slung his coat over his shoulders. He turned to face her, ready to offer her what little money he had, to point her toward the nearest real town, to say goodbye. But before he could speak, she stood up. She looked small and frail in the center of the room, yet her jaw was set, her gaze direct. "When you leave," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling, "I want to ride with you." She took a breath, and the words came out in a raw, honest rush. "I won't survive if I'm left alone." Eli looked at her, at the woman with no name and a past full of ghosts, and he saw not a burden, but a reflection of his own solitary existence. He saw another soul the world had tried to break. He thought of his brother, of the promises he had made to himself over a fresh grave. He was a man who protected the weak, a man who stood for those who could not stand for themselves. He could not turn her away. He would not. He gave a single, slow nod. "Get your things," he said. "We ride at noon." The world opened up south of the cabin, a vast, rolling expanse of white and gray under a steel-colored sky. They rode for days, with Gideon carrying them both. She was light, almost weightless, and sat behind him with her hands resting tentatively on the back of his saddle. Never on him. The silence that had filled the cabin traveled with them, but it changed its nature out in the open. It was no longer the silence of caution, but of companionship. They did not need to fill the emptiness with words. The creak of the leather, the crunch of Gideon's hooves in the snow, and the low moan of the wind were conversation enough. At night, they made small camps. Eli was efficient, building a fire, preparing a simple meal of bacon and hardtack, and setting out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. He would watch her as she stared into the fire, her face a mask of old sorrows illuminated by the dancing light. He saw the way she rubbed her bare ring finger, a nervous, unconscious gesture. He saw the tension in her shoulders that never fully eased, even when she slept. He still did not know her name, and he found he did not want to. Giving her a name would be to tether her to the past she was so clearly running from. For now, she was the woman he had found by the fire, a mystery he felt a growing, dangerous need to protect. One evening, as a thin snow began to fall, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You have not asked me my name. You have not asked where I came from, or what I did." Eli looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "No, ma'am. You must wonder." It was not a question. "Wondering is a private thing," he said, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. "Asking is different. That's a trespass." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the snowflakes hiss and disappear in the flames. "I would ask you not to," she said finally. "Do not ask about my past. Please, I cannot speak of it." He met her gaze across the fire. Her eyes were pleading, but also strong, as if this one request was the last piece of herself she had any control over. He saw the trap in it. To know her past would be to understand her, but it would also be to own a part of her she was not ready to give. He had learned long ago that some burdens were meant to be carried alone, at least for a while. He nodded once. "All right." And then it happened. The corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly at first, and then a true smile broke across her face. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, like a winter flower blooming in the snow, but it transformed her. The weariness and sorrow in her eyes retreated for an instant, replaced by a light that was wholly her own. It was the first time he had seen it, and the sight struck him with an unexpected force, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a promise of the woman she might have been, the woman she could be again. The smile faded as quickly as it appeared, but it left an echo in the space between them, a new understanding that was more binding than any promise. They arrived at the Double Creek Ranch a week later. It lay in a wide, sheltered valley where the snow was thinner, a collection of sturdy log buildings that looked like they had grown out of the earth itself. The owner, Silas Croft, was a man in his 50s with a thick gray beard and eyes that had seen too many harsh winters. He greeted Eli with a firm handshake and a worried expression. "Morgan, glad you made it," Silas said, his gaze flicking to the woman standing quietly behind Eli. "The rustlers have gotten bolder. Hit a neighbor 2 nights ago. Took 20 head. "That's what I'm here for," Eli said. He gestured slightly with his head. "This is a friend. She's traveling on to the next town. Needed a safe escort this far. I was hoping she could stay on a few weeks, until the weather breaks for good." Silas studied her for a moment. He was a decent man, but a cautious one. A strange woman was a complication. "We are not set up for ladies here." "She can earn her keep," Eli said quickly. "She's a hard worker." Before Silas could protest further, a stout woman with flour on her apron and kindness in her face came out of the main house. This was Martha, Silas's cook, housekeeper, and the undisputed heart of the ranch. "Silas Croft, you leave the poor girl be," Martha said, wiping her hands on her apron. She smiled at the woman. "You look half frozen. Dear, come inside. I've got stew on the stove that'll put the feeling back in your bones." The woman looked at Eli, a question in her eyes. He gave a small nod, and she followed Martha into the house. Leaving Eli to talk business with Silas, he had kept her identity secret. For now, he knew that in a place like this, a woman's reputation was as fragile as an icicle. Life at the ranch fell into a new rhythm. Eli spent his days and many of his nights in the saddle, patrolling the vast borders of the Double Creek, learning the land, looking for tracks, for any sign of the thieves. The tension Silas had spoken of was a palpable thing. The valley was home to not only the ranch, but also a handful of smaller homesteaders, families trying to scratch a living from the unforgiving soil. Silas suspected some of them might be in league with the rustlers, feeding them information. It was Eli's job to sort truth from suspicion without starting a range war. The woman, whom Martha had taken to calling Anna after she had refused to give her own name, found her place in the kitchen. She worked from before dawn until after dusk, helping Martha knead bread, peel potatoes, and serve the dozen hungry ranch hands who filled the cookhouse for meals. The simple, repetitive work seemed to soothe her. The warmth of the kitchen thawed the chill that had settled so deep inside her. For the first time since Eli had met her, he saw her hands lose their bruised, raw look and become dusted with flour instead. She was quiet, almost invisible, but he saw the change. A sense of purpose was slowly seeping back into her, filling the hollow places. But her silence made others uneasy. The ranch hands, a rough and superstitious lot, started to whisper. They wondered who she was and why Eli Morgan, a man who always rode alone, had brought her here. Her refusal to speak of her past was mistaken for arrogance, her quietness for judgment. They saw the way Eli's eyes would find her across a crowded room, the subtle way he positioned himself between her and any man who looked at her for too long. They grew suspicious, and their suspicion was a low-grade poison, tainting the fragile peace she had begun to find. One night, Eli found her standing by the corral, staring out at the snow-covered hills under a sky littered with stars. The day had been long and cold, and the weariness was heavy on him. "You should be inside," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The kitchen gets too hot sometimes," she answered, her breath a white cloud in the air. "I like the cold now. It feels clean." They stood in silence for a while. The only sounds the nicker of a horse and the distant cry of a coyote. "Silas is a good man," she said, "but the others, they do not like me being here." "They are not used to things they cannot understand," Eli replied. She turned to look at him, her face pale in the starlight. "And you, do you understand me, Eli?" It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded different in her voice, softer. He shook his head. "No, but I understand what it is to have a past you cannot speak of." He leaned against the top rail of the corral, the old wood groaning under his weight. And then, without planning to, he began to speak. He told her about Samuel, about his laugh and his dreams. He told her about the creek and the land dispute, about the arrogance of Jedediah Thorne. He spoke of the trial, the paid witnesses, the corrupt judge, the crushing weight of a justice system that had failed him. "I wanted to kill him," Eli confessed, his voice low and raw with the memory. "I had my gun. I followed him from the courthouse, but I kept seeing my brother's face, and I knew he would not have wanted me to become a killer like Thorne. He believed in doing things the right way, even when the world was wrong." He sighed, a ragged sound in the cold air. "So I live with it. I try to live a life that honors him. I try to find a different kind of justice out here. But some days the guilt of not avenging him is a heavy thing to carry." He had not spoken of this to anyone, not in such detail, not ever. But saying it to her felt right. It felt necessary. When he finished, she did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She simply reached out and, for the first time, touched him. Her fingers rested for a moment on his forearm. A light, hesitant pressure. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of acknowledgement, of shared humanity. And in that small touch, he felt a measure of his burden lift. The bunkhouse was a long, open room filled with the snores and smells of a dozen sleeping men. Eli had a cot in the corner. For Anna, Silas had cleared out a small storage room at the back, giving her a bit of privacy. A thin wooden wall was all that separated them. Most nights, Eli lay awake, listening. He could hear the rustle of her turning in her narrow bed, the soft sound of her breathing. He knew she did not sleep well. Tonight, after his confession at the corral, the silence from her room was different. It felt heavier, charged with unspoken thoughts. He lay on his back, staring into the darkness, When he heard a faint creak, he turned his head. In the sliver of moonlight coming through the grimy window, he saw her standing in the doorway of her room. She stood there for a long time, a silhouette of fear and indecision. Then, slowly, she moved toward his cot. She knelt on the floor beside him, her face just inches from his. He could see the faint glimmer of tears on her cheeks. Her whole body was trembling, not from cold, but from a deep, internal tremor. She wanted comfort. She wanted to not be alone with the ghosts that his story had stirred up in her. He saw her lean forward, her lips parting as if to say something, her body yearning for a human connection that went beyond words. His heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her into his arms and hold her until the trembling stopped. He wanted to be the safe harbor she was so desperately seeking. But just as she was about to close the small distance between them, she froze. A look of sheer terror crossed her face, as if she had touched a hot stove. She recoiled violently, scrambling back from the cot as if he were the source of her fear. She turned and fled back into her little room, pulling the door shut with a soft, final click. Eli was left alone in the darkness, his hand clenched into a fist at his side, the ache of her retreat sharper than any physical blow. Her marriage had begun with sunshine and sermons. Reverend Gideon Whitley was a pillar of his community, a man whose voice could make the angels weep and sinners repent. He was handsome, charismatic, and when he turned his attention to Anna, the orphan daughter of a farmer, she felt she had been blessed. He spoke of love, devotion, and a righteous life. She believed every word. The change was gradual, insidious. It began after the wedding, behind the closed doors of the parsonage. His public piety became a tool for private control. Her opinions, once celebrated, were now deemed frivolous. Her friendships were judged unseemly for a preacher's wife. He corrected her posture, her speech, her very thoughts, all under the guise of helping her become a more godly woman. The house grew quiet, filled with the weight of his unspoken expectations and the fear of his displeasure. His touch, once gentle, became a form of ownership. He would grip her arm too tightly when he was displeased, his fingers leaving bruises that she would hide under long sleeves. His love was conditional, a reward for perfect obedience, and his anger was a cold, simmering thing that could erupt over a burnt meal or a misplaced book. He called it righteous anger, God's disappointment channeled through him. She called it terror. She had been pregnant once, a son. She had felt a joy so fierce it had briefly burned away the fear. But the child had been born sickly and had slipped away from the world after only a few short weeks. Gideon had been away, preaching a revival in another town. When he returned, he did not comfort her. He told her it was God's will, a punishment for some secret sin in her heart that she had failed to confess. Her grief, in his eyes, was a selfish indulgence. It was then that she truly understood she was not his wife, but his prisoner. The night of the fire, he had been in a rage. A deacon had complimented Anna's singing in the choir, a simple, innocent remark. To Gideon, it was a spark of defiance. He accused her of tempting other men, of shaming him with her vanity. He had been drinking, a secret habit he indulged in when his righteousness became too heavy a burden. He grabbed a lantern from the mantel, his eyes wild. He screamed her name. "Anna!" The sound full of venom and possession. He raised the lantern, and she stumbled back. He tripped over a rug, and the lantern flew from his hand, shattering against the wall. Oil and flame exploded across the dry wooden planks. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Smoke filled the room, hot and choking. Gideon lay on the floor, stunned. Anna tried to drag him, but he was a heavy man, and the flames were closing in. The heat was searing, the smoke blinding. She screamed for him to get up, but he only coughed and swore at her. A burning beam fell from the ceiling, blocking her path to him. She scrambled out the back door, her lungs burning, her skin blistering. the sound of the fire and his final, enraged curses roaring in her ears. She ran. She did not stop running until the town was a faint glow behind her, and then she kept running still, into the unforgiving wilderness. The attack came at dusk. A volley of gunshots ripped through the quiet evening, splintering the wood of the main house. Men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, rode out of the trees, yelling and firing, driving a small group of cattle from a nearby pasture. They were miners from the camp over the ridge, drunk and reckless. Chaos erupted. Silas and the ranch hands grabbed their rifles, returning fire from the windows of the bunkhouse. Eli was already moving, his actions swift and precise. He took a position behind a water trough, his pistol bucking in his hand, firing not to kill but to drive them back, to protect the houses. His first thought was for Anna. He scanned the yard, his gut tight with fear. He saw her for a second, a flash of her dress as she ran from the cookhouse, her face white with terror. She was heading for the barn. Good. It was solid, defensible. He laid down covering fire, forcing two of the riders to veer away, giving her time to get inside. The firefight was short and brutal. The miners were not soldiers. They were opportunistic thieves. Faced with organized resistance, their courage, fueled by cheap whiskey, evaporated. One of them fell from his horse, and the others grabbed him and fled back into the darkness, leaving half the stolen cattle behind. A heavy silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the nervous whinny of the horses. Eli stayed low, scanning the tree line, making sure it was not a feint. When he was certain they were gone, he stood up, reloading his pistol with practiced movements. His heart was still pounding, but not from the fight. He strode across the yard to the barn, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air. The large doors were slightly ajar. He slipped inside. "Anna," he called out, his voice low. It was dark inside, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. He heard a sound from the back, a small, choked sob. He followed it, moving past the empty stalls until he found her. She was crouched in the corner, huddled behind a stack of old saddles, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was shaking uncontrollably, her face buried in her arms. He knelt in front of her. "It is over," he said softly. "They are gone. You are safe." She looked up at him, and what he saw in her eyes broke his heart. It was not just fear, it was a profound and terrible shame, a self-loathing so deep it seemed to swallow the light. The violence had triggered something in her, tearing open the wound of her past. She saw not a protector, but another man with a gun, another participant in a world of brutality she could not escape. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hopeless. Her voice was a ragged whisper, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm not worth any of this." Eli's own soul recoiled at her words. He saw in her a brokenness that mirrored his own, a belief that she was tainted beyond repair. Every part of him wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, to list the ways her quiet strength had already begun to change him. But he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that words would be useless. They would be just noises against the roar of her pain. So he said nothing. He simply stayed there, kneeling in the straw-dusted darkness of the barn, his presence a silent, unwavering disagreement. He would not touch her, but he would not leave her alone. And in the shared, desolate quiet, he let his silence be his answer. The raid left a scar on the Double Creek Ranch. It was not in the splintered wood of the bunkhouse or the trampled mud of the corral, but in the air itself. A quiet, watchful tension settled over the men. They cleaned their guns more often, and their conversations were clipped and low. Silas Croft's face seemed to have acquired a few new lines overnight. He had lost cattle, but what worried him more was the violation. the sense that the invisible walls around his land had been breached. Anna retreated further into herself. The brief flowering of confidence she had found in the kitchen withered. She moved like a ghost through the cookhouse, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling as she served the men. She was polite, but distant, and her silence began to feel less like a mystery and more like an accusation. The whispers among the hands grew louder, uglier. They connected the trouble to her arrival, as if her mere presence was a bad omen. Eli saw it all. He felt the shift in the atmosphere, the sideways glances aimed at Anna. He knew the fragile peace they had found was dissolving. His patrols became longer, his temper shorter. The need to protect her was a constant, burning coal in his gut. A few weeks after the raid, he rode into Jericho Springs for salt and grain, leaving Anna under the watchful, if reluctant, eye of Martha. The town was buzzing. The story of the preacher's widow from back east had grown legs. It was no longer just gossip. It was a legend, told with relish in the saloon and the general store. The woman, Anna Whitley, was a temptress, a black widow who had bewitched a deacon and burned her own husband in his bed. A warrant had been issued. A reward was offered, and a man had come to collect. Eli saw him in the saloon, where he had stopped for a beer to wash the trail dust from his throat. The man sat alone at a corner table, nursing a whiskey, his back to the wall. He was not large or loud, but he radiated a cold, patient stillness that made him the most dangerous man in the room. He had a narrow face, a tidy black beard, and coin-colored eyes that missed nothing. A poster, nailed to the wall behind the bar, showed a crude drawing of a woman's face. Below it, the words were stark. Wanted, Anna Whitley, for the crimes of adultery and arson. Eli finished his beer, his movements measured and calm. Though his mind was racing, he recognized the man's trade in the way he watched the door, in the professional weariness of his posture. A bounty hunter. Eli bought his supplies, his face an unreadable mask, and rode out of town, not toward the ranch, but in a wide circle, checking his back trail. The hunter was good. He made no move to follow. He was content to wait, to let the gossip and the greed of others do his work for him. Back at the Double Creek, Eli found Silas by the smokehouse. "I'm riding out in the morning," he said, without preamble. "My business here is done." Silas frowned. "The rustlers." "That was a one-time thing," Eli cut in. "Drunk miners. They won't be back soon. You have enough hands to watch the herd. I have been paid for my time." It was a lie, but a necessary one. He could not tell Silas the truth. It would put the whole ranch in danger. Silas, who valued loyalty, looked hurt, but he also saw the hard set of Eli's jaw and knew the decision was final. He simply nodded. "As you wish, Morgan." Eli found Anna stacking firewood behind the kitchen. He did not speak until she had set the last log in place. "We are leaving," he said, his voice low. "At first light." She turned, her face pale. She did not ask why. She had been living on borrowed time, and she knew it. The terror he had seen in the barn was still there, lurking just behind her eyes, but it was overlaid now with a weary resignation. She simply nodded. "I will be ready." They left before the sun, slipping away from the ranch like thieves in the night. Eli left a note for Silas with a month's wages, a silent apology for his abrupt departure. He had traded his buckskin for 2 hardier mountain horses, and they rode north, into the jagged teeth of the mountains, where the snow lay deep and the trails were few. The bounty hunter would expect them to head for a major town, for a stagecoach line. Eli would take the path no one else was foolish enough to travel. The journey was harder this time. The cold was more intense, the terrain more treacherous. The silence between them returned, but it was thick with unspoken fear. He was a man fleeing a past failure of justice. She was a woman fleeing a current accusation of it. They were two fugitives, running from the same beast in different forms. One afternoon, they stopped by a river that was mostly frozen over, a ribbon of black, fast-moving water visible in the center, while Eli watered the horses. Anna knelt at the edge of the ice. She broke a thin crust with a stone and plunged her hands into the frigid water. She began to wash them, a frantic, scrubbing motion, as if trying to remove a stain that was not on her skin, but in her soul. She gasped from the cold, her face contorted in pain, but she did not stop. Eli went to her, kneeling beside her on the frozen bank. "Anna," he said, using the name he had overheard, the name from her nightmare. She froze, her hands still in the water, and looked up at him. Her eyes were wide with shock and fear. "Your hands will be ruined," he said gently. Ignoring her shock, he reached out and pulled her hands from the water. They were bright red, already stiffening from the cold. He took off his gloves and began to dry them with his own handkerchief, his touch slow and careful. He held her small, icy hands in his large, warm ones, rubbing them gently, trying to bring the life back into them. It was an act of such simple, profound tenderness that it breached her defenses. A single tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto his hand. He did not acknowledge it. He just kept drying her hands until they were warm again. That night, the cold was a living thing, a predator stalking the edges of their small fire. They huddled close to the flames, wrapped in their bedrolls, but the chill seeped in through the ground. Sometime in the deep darkness before dawn, he felt her move. She unrolled her bedding and shifted closer to him, her back pressing against his for warmth. Her body was tense, her breathing shallow. It was a move born of pure necessity, of survival, but it was the most intimate thing that had ever passed between them. He did not move, did not speak for a long time, afraid that any motion would shatter the fragile trust she had just shown. "You think I am a coward?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it over the wind. "For running." He thought of her bare feet in the snow, of her quiet endurance at the ranch, of her frantic washing at the river. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have never met a woman braver than you." He felt the tension in her body ease, just a fraction. She did not reply, but she settled against him, and for the first time they shared not just a fire, but a small, desperate circle of warmth against the vast, consuming cold of the world. After 3 more days of hard travel, they reached their destination. Tucked away in a high, hidden valley was a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. This was the home of Nalin, a friend from a life Eli rarely spoke of. He had known her family years ago, before the world had soured on him. She was an Apache woman who had chosen to live alone, a woman who understood the wisdom of solitude and the language of the mountains. She met them at the door, a small, ageless woman with eyes as dark and knowing as a forest at midnight. She looked at Eli, then her gaze shifted to Anna, and she saw everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the grief Anna carried like a second shawl. Nalin did not ask questions. She simply stood aside. "You are welcome here," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. The cabin was warm and smelled of cedar and herbs. Nalin gave them hot, bitter tea and a stew made with wild roots and rabbit. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence both calming and unnerving. She seemed to see straight through the walls Anna had built around herself. Later that evening, while Eli was outside tending to the horses, Nalin sat with Anna by the fire. She said nothing, simply worked on a piece of beadwork, her fingers nimble and sure. The silence was not empty. It was patient, expectant. It was a silence that invited confession. And Anna, who had held her story inside for so long it had begun to poison her, finally broke. The words came out in a torrent, a flood of pain held back for too long. She told Nalin everything, about Gideon, the control, the fear, the fire, but the heart of her story, the deepest, most infected wound, was something she had not even allowed herself to think about for months. "I had a child," she whispered, her voice cracking, her body racked with sobs. "A son. He was so small. I could see the tiny blue veins on his eyelids when he slept." Her breath hitched. "He got a sickness in his lungs. The doctor could do nothing. I prayed. I have never prayed so hard in my life. I begged God. I begged." She looked up at Nylan, her face a mask of raw, ancient grief. "My husband, Gideon, he was away, preaching. When he came back, the baby was gone. I had buried him myself, in a small box I made. And Gideon, he told me it was my fault, that God was punishing me for my vanity, for some secret sin. He would not even visit the grave." Her voice dissolved into a keen of pure agony. "He made me feel that my grief was a sin, that I was unworthy of being a mother, unworthy of even mourning my own child." The sobs that followed were not just for her son, but for herself, for the woman who had been made to believe she was so broken, so fundamentally flawed, that God himself had turned his back on her. It was the grief that had hollowed out her eyes, the shame that had driven her into the snow. Eli had entered the cabin silently during her confession. He stood in the shadows by the door, his heart feeling as if it were being crushed in a vice. He was shaken to his very core. Her pain was so immense, so profound. It made his own quest for vengeance seem small and selfish. Nylan rose and placed a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder, murmuring something in her own language, words of comfort that transcended translation. Eli stepped forward into the firelight. Anna looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression full of shame at having been overheard. He did not know what to say. The words he had, words of justice and right and wrong, were useless here. So he offered her the only thing he could, his own brokenness. "My father did not die of old age," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had not felt in years. "He was a good man, stood up for a freedman who was being cheated by a land agent. The agent had friends. They came for my father in the night. They dragged him from our house, my mother, Samuel, and I. We watched." He swallowed, the memory thick as mud in his throat. "They hanged him from the big oak tree by the road. I was 16. I cut him down myself the next morning. I dug the grave. I buried my own father. And I have never cried since." The silence that followed was absolute. In the small, warm cabin, two souls stood stripped bare, their deepest wounds exposed in the flickering firelight. Nylan quietly slipped out, leaving them alone. Anna looked at him, her tears slowing. She saw him then, not as a rescuer, not as a stoic cowboy, but as a man as shattered as she was. She rose from her stool and came to him. She did not speak. She simply laid a hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was a question, a plea, and an offering all at once. He covered her hand with his own. The touch was electric, a current of shared pain and desperate need. He slowly lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was slow and quiet and deeply human. He led her to the small sleeping alcove, and they came together not in a frenzy of seduction, but in a slow, deliberate act of survival. It was a silent conversation in the darkness, their bodies speaking a language of loneliness and comfort. It was two people, lost in the wilderness of their own grief, finding a momentary anchor in the dark. It was the mending of fractured souls, a way of feeling alive when the world had done its best to kill every part of them that mattered. There was no shame, no guilt, only the profound, animal comfort of one warm body pressed against another, a shield against the cold that lived inside them both. They lay tangled together as the first pale light of dawn crept into the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, and the world outside was still and silent. Anna was nestled in the crook of his arm, her head on his shoulder. He had not slept. He had simply held her, feeling the steady, miraculous rhythm of her breathing. She stirred, and he thought she was still asleep. But then she spoke, her voice a soft, clear whisper against his skin, a statement of fact that would change everything. "I do not want to run anymore." Her words hung in the cold dawn air of Nalen's cabin, a declaration that was both a promise and a death sentence. "I do not want to run anymore." Eli heard the finality in it, the sound of a gate clanging shut on one part of her life. Running was what had kept her alive, but it had also been a cage. Now she was choosing to stand still, even if it meant standing on a gallows. He understood. He had been standing still his whole life, waiting for a fight that had never come. Now, it seemed, her fight had become his. They stayed with Nalen for another week, allowing Anna to gather a strength that was more than physical. It was a hardening of the soul, a quiet forging of will. When they left, they rode not north into deeper wilderness, but east, back toward the scab-like settlement of Jericho Springs. It was a fool's move, a march back into the mouth of the wolf. But it was the only direction her newfound resolve would allow. They did not speak of what they would do, or how they would live. They simply rode, a silent two-person army against a world of whispers. Jericho Springs had not changed, but the feeling of it had. The bounty hunter, a man Eli learned was named Cortland, was no longer a shadow in the saloon. He was a fixture, often seen speaking with Sheriff Brody on the boardwalk. Brody was a man Eli knew well. He was a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose loyalties were for sale to the highest bidder. It was Brody who had lost the key evidence against Jedediah Thorne all those years ago. Seeing him now, nodding and smiling with the man hired to hunt Anna, turned something cold and hard in Eli's gut. The law in this town was not a shield for the innocent. It was a club for the powerful. Eli rented a small, run-down cabin on the edge of town, paying for it with the last of his wages from the Double Creek. It was little more than a shack, but it had 4 walls and a door that locked. It was their fortress. While Anna turned the dusty, neglected space into a home, scrubbing floors and patching curtains, Eli rode into town for supplies. He was tying his horse to the hitching post outside the general store when Sheriff Brody approached, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his expression one of weary authority. "Morgan," Brody said, his eyes avoiding Eli's. "I heard you were back." "I never left for good," Eli replied, his voice flat. "That woman you have with you," Brody said, lowering his voice. "There is a warrant, a reward. You are harboring a fugitive. That is a serious crime." "I am giving shelter to a woman in need," Eli said, his gaze as steady and sharp as a nail. "Is that still a crime in your town?" Brody sighed, a puff of condescending pity. "Listen to me, Eli. I am trying to help you. I know you have a history of getting involved, but this is not some land dispute. This is murder, arson. Send her on her way before Cortland decides to collect his bounty from both of you." "Is that a warning from you, Sheriff?" Eli asked. "Or are you just delivering a message for your new business partner?" The shot hit its mark. A dull flush crept up Brody's neck. "Just stay out of trouble, Morgan," he mumbled, turning and walking away. A man defeated by a fight that had barely begun. The true trouble started on Sunday. A new preacher had arrived in town, a Reverend Miller. He was a traveling sermonizer, a man with a booming voice and a Bible he wielded like a weapon. His church was the biggest building in town, and on Sunday, it was the center of the universe, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The townsfolk packed the pews, eager to hear what the man of God had to say about the sinners in their midst. Eli and Anna did not go, but they heard about the sermon later. Miller had spoken of serpents in the garden, of Jezebels who tempted good men to their doom. He did not use Anna's name, but he did not have to. He painted a vivid picture of a mysterious woman, a runaway with a dark past, a temptress who had brought trouble with her. He twisted scripture into a noose, and with every word, he tightened it around Anna's neck. The fear and suspicion that had been simmering in the town was now sanctified, given a holy righteousness. The next Sunday, Eli went to church. He went alone. He stood at the back, his arms crossed over his chest. A silent, grim-faced sentinel. Miller was in fine form, his voice rising and falling, his words painting Anna as the agent of the devil. He spoke of the fire that had killed her husband, calling it the flames of hell itself, a punishment for her wicked ways. When he was finished, and the last strains of a mournful hymn died out, Eli walked down the center aisle. A hush fell over the congregation. All eyes were on him. He stopped at the foot of the pulpit and looked up at the preacher. "Reverend," Eli said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "you speak of truth, but you have never once spoken to the woman you are condemning. You have judged her on rumors and posters. Is that God's truth, or is it just town gossip dressed up in holy robes?" Miller's face purpled. "This is a house of God, sir. You will not bring your blasphemy in here." "The last I checked, the house of God was a place for mercy, not a place to rally a mob." Eli continued, his voice never rising. "You talk of serpents. You should be careful. Sometimes the most dangerous ones wear a preacher's collar and speak with a silver tongue." He turned his back on the sputtering preacher and looked at the faces in the pews. He saw men who had once called him a friend, men he had shared a drink with, now looking at him with suspicion and anger. He had drawn his line in the sand, and he could see he was standing on the wrong side of it. He walked out of the church, the silence he left behind heavier than any sermon. While the town turned against her, Anna found her own kind of church. On the poorest edge of town was a small clinic run by Doc Abernathy, a man whose hands trembled from age and whiskey, but whose heart was still good. The clinic was always full of sick children, the families of miners and homesteaders who had no money for proper care. The place was dirty, undersupplied, and smelled of sickness and despair. Anna walked in one morning and simply started working. She asked for nothing. She swept the floors, boiled water for bandages, and sat with feverish children, cooling their foreheads with damp rags. She had a touch, a quiet, calming presence that seemed to soothe the fretful and comfort the dying. Doc Abernathy, too tired to ask questions, was simply grateful for the help. The poor and the outcast of Jericho Springs, the ones who were ignored by the likes of Reverend Miller, saw her differently. They saw not a temptress, but a woman with kind hands and sad eyes. They saw her tending to their children, sharing the little food she had, her compassion a quiet rebuke to the loud condemnations from the pulpit. Respect for her began to grow in the muddy alleys and drafty shacks that the rest of the town preferred to ignore. One afternoon, a little girl of about 5, her body thin and frail from consumption, was lying on a cot, her breathing shallow. Anna was sitting beside her, humming a soft, wordless tune. The girl opened her eyes and looked up at Anna. "You remind me of my mama," the girl whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "She died last winter. She used to sing to me, too." Anna's humming stopped. A wave of grief so powerful it almost buckled her washed over her. She saw not this child, but her own son, his face pale, his breathing labored. She saw the tiny grave she had dug in the frozen earth. She had to stand and walk to the window, her back to the room, and she wept, silent tears streaming down her face for the child she had lost, for the mother she had never been allowed to be. In an attempt to show the town they were not afraid, that they were a part of the community, Eli asked Anna to go with him to the town dance. It was a foolish gesture, an act of defiance he knew was doomed, but he had to try. She agreed, and for the occasion, she remade an old dress, her needle and thread moving with a determined hope. When they walked into the town hall, the music and laughter faltered for a beat. It was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The whispers started immediately, ripples of malice spreading through the room. Men who once would have clapped Eli on the back now turned away. Women appraised Anna with cold, judgmental eyes. their gaze lingering on the simple dress as if it were a scarlet sin. They danced one dance, a clumsy waltz, moving together in a small bubble of isolation while the rest of the room swirled around them. They were a spectacle, a sideshow for the town's entertainment. The jealousy of the women and the suspicion of the men was a physical force, pressing in on them. After the song ended, they left, the sound of the music starting up behind them, louder and more cheerful now that the blight on their evening was gone. They were in the dark alley beside the hall when a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was Cortland, the bounty hunter. He was not holding a gun. He did not need to. His presence was threat enough. He ignored Eli and spoke directly to Anna, his voice a low, chilling murmur. "You are a hard woman to find, Mrs. Whitley, but you are not a hard woman to understand. You have brought this man to ruin. You will do the same to this whole town if they let you. A word of advice. The morning train goes east. Be on it." Before Anna could react, Eli stepped in front of her. "She is done running," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Cortland finally looked at Eli, a flicker of amusement in his coin-colored eyes. "You have a hero's heart, Morgan. They are the easiest to break." "Get out of our way," Eli said. Cortland smiled, a thin, cruel line. "I do not think so." He took a half-step forward, reaching for Anna. Eli moved faster than a striking snake. His fist shot out, a hard, compact explosion of rage and frustration. The sound of bone connecting with cartilage was sickeningly loud in the quiet alley. Cortland staggered back, his hand flying to his face, blood pouring from his shattered nose. He looked at Eli, his eyes wide with surprise and a newfound respect. "This is not over," Cortland snarled, his voice thick with blood. "If you ever come near her again," Eli said, his voice a low promise of violence, "I will finish it, permanently." Cortland held his gaze for a long moment, then spat a bloody wad onto the ground, turned, and disappeared into the shadows. The walk back to the cabin was silent, the air thick with the aftermath of the violence. The pretense was over. The hope that they could find a peaceful life here was shattered, just like the bounty hunter's nose. Inside the cabin, Eli lit a lamp, the soft glow filling the small room. Anna stood by the cold stove, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and the weight of what he had brought upon her crushed him. He had thought he was protecting her, but he had only made her a bigger target. He walked to his saddlebags and pulled out a small, heavy pouch and a folded piece of paper. He set them on the table, a train ticket and a roll of money, enough to get her far away, to start a new life somewhere no one had ever heard the name Anna Whitley. "The morning train goes east," he said, his voice hoarse, echoing the bounty hunter's words. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He was offering her an escape, a way out. He was offering to tear his own heart out if it meant she would be safe. She looked at the ticket, then up at him. Her eyes searched his face, and she saw not a man trying to get rid of her, but a man in agony, a man willing to sacrifice his own small chance at happiness for her survival. Slowly, she walked to the table. She picked up the ticket. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she would take it. Instead, she turned to the stove, opened the small iron door, and dropped the ticket onto the cold ashes inside. She took a match from the box on the mantel, struck it, and tossed it in after the ticket. A small flame licked at the edge of the paper. They both watched as it curled, turned black, and vanished into smoke. The fire of her past had almost destroyed her. Now, a new fire was setting her free. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing in the lamplight. All the fear and doubt burned away, leaving only a pure, defiant strength. "I would rather die in this place with you," she said, her voice shaking but strong, "than run again and live alone." The dam inside him broke. All the pent-up frustration, the fear, the desperate, unspoken longing for her surged through him. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her, not gently this time, not with the quiet comfort of their night in the mountains. This was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of two people clinging to each other in a storm. It was fiery and raw, and filled with all the pain and desire they had hidden for so long. It was not a surrender. It was a declaration of war. The brittle peace of their shared defiance lasted 4 days. On the morning of the 5th, they came for her. Eli was splitting wood behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat in the cold morning air. Anna was inside, humming softly as she kneaded dough for bread. It was a scene of such simple, domestic tranquility that its shattering felt like a physical violation. Cortland did not come alone. He rode up with Sheriff Brody and 2 grim-faced deputies, their horses fanning out to surround the small cabin. They moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of men who knew they had already won. Eli saw them first, and his blood ran cold. He lowered the axe slowly, his knuckles white. There would be no fight this time. Not a fist fight in an alley, but a confrontation with the full, corrupt weight of the law. Sheriff Brody dismounted, a warrant held in his hand like a shield. "Anna Whitley," he called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. "By the authority of the territory of Wyoming, you are under arrest for the crimes of arson and suspicion of murder." The cabin door opened. Anna stood there, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She did not look at Brody or the bounty hunter. She looked at Eli. In that one look, a lifetime of fear, defiance, and a new, fragile love passed between them. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, a silent command not to fight, not to run. Her shoulders sagged for a fraction of a second, and then she straightened them, lifting her chin. "I will come with you," she said, her voice clear and calm. "Let me get my shawl." Cortland smirked, his nose still swollen and bruised from Eli's fist. "I will get it for her." He made a move toward the door, but Eli stepped in his path, the axe still held loosely in his hand. "You will not set foot in that house," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "The sheriff can escort her." Brody, anxious to avoid more violence, nodded quickly. "That is right. Let her get her things." Anna retrieved her shawl and walked out of the cabin. She did not look back at the life they had started to build inside it. As a deputy moved to put manacles on her wrists, she flinched. "That is not necessary," Eli said, his eyes locking with Brody's. "She will not run." Brody hesitated, then gave a curt nod to his deputy. They placed her on a horse, and the small posse turned to leave. As they rode away, Anna looked back at Eli one last time. He stood alone in the clearing, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. He did not look defeated. He looked like a storm gathering on the horizon. The trial, if one could call it that, was held in the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with the smells of sweat, cheap perfume, and self-righteousness. It was not a court of law. It was a public spectacle, and Anna was the main attraction. She sat beside a court-appointed lawyer, a young man so nervous he could barely speak, his face slick with perspiration. Eli stood at the back of the room, his presence a silent, smoldering rebuke to the entire proceeding. Judge Hemlock presided, an old, tired man whose face was a roadmap of compromises and retreats. He valued order above all else, and the town of Jericho Springs wanted the disorderly element of Anna Whitley removed. The prosecution, led by a lawyer hired by Reverend Miller's congregation, began its case. They called a young man to the stand, a former assistant to Anna's husband. The man, Peter, was pale and fidgety, his eyes darting around the room, never once landing on Anna. He testified that Mrs. Whitley had been unhappy in her marriage, that she had made inappropriate overtures toward him. He spoke of lingering touches when she handed him a book, of sad smiles he had misinterpreted as invitations. He twisted her quiet kindness into a web of seduction. "And on the night of the fire?" the lawyer prompted. "She had argued with the Reverend," Peter stammered. "I heard them from my room. Later, after it was over, I saw her running from the house. She did not scream for help, she just ran." Next, they called a neighbor, a woman with a sour, pinched face who clearly relished the attention. She testified that she had seen Anna meeting the deacon in the church garden, that their heads had been bent close together in conspiracy. She claimed that on the night of the fire, she had smelled not just wood smoke, but kerosene, a detail no one else had ever mentioned. Lie after lie, each one adding another stone to the wall being built around Anna. She sat through it all with a quiet, unnerving composure, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. She seemed untouchable, a statue of dignity in a sea of malice. The prosecution rested its case, confident and smug. The air in the room was thick with condemnation. Judge Hemlock looked ready to pronounce sentence. It was then that Eli moved. He strode down the center aisle, his boot heels echoing in the tense silence. "Judge Hemlock," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with a badge. "Before you proceed, there is a matter of record this court should consider." The judge scowled. "Who are you, sir? You are not a party to this trial." "My name is Eli Morgan," he said, and a murmur went through the crowd. His name was known, and I am a witness, not to this case, but to the quality of justice in this town. He turned and looked directly at Sheriff Brody. "Years ago, my younger brother, Samuel Morgan, was murdered in cold blood by a man named Jedediah Thorne. He was beaten to death over a water rights dispute. There was no question of Thorne's guilt. And yet, he walked free from this very room." The crowd shifted, whispering. This was old history, a wound the town had long since covered over. "Sheriff Brody," Eli said, his voice like cracking ice. "Can you tell the court what happened to the shovel Jedediah Thorne used to murder my brother, the key piece of evidence in the trial?" Brody's face went white. "It was misplaced, a clerical error." "A convenient error," Eli shot back. "An error that coincided with Thorne buying 100 acres of land from you for twice its value. Justice in this town, judge, is a commodity. It can be bought and sold. You are hearing testimony today from paid liars and gossips, orchestrated by men who want this woman gone. I ask you to consider that the law in Jericho Springs has been proven to be for sale before. How can you be sure it is not for sale today?" He had risked everything. He had laid his own raw, unhealed wound bare for the whole town to see, turning his private grief into a public weapon. He had made powerful enemies and shown his hand, but he had also planted a seed of doubt, a question that now hung in the air like smoke. Judge Hemlock, visibly shaken, called a recess. The trial would resume in the afternoon. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by a tense, uncertain energy. The prosecution, in a final, dramatic move, called Reverend Miller to the stand. Miller strode to the witness box, his face a mask of pious sorrow. He spoke of his dear departed friend, Reverend Whitley, a man of God. He spoke of his concern for Anna, of his attempts to guide her back to a righteous path. And then he turned, his eyes full of a terrible, righteous fire, and looked at Anna. "But some souls cannot be saved," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "Some are vessels of sin, sent to test the faithful. She is a woman who destroys good men. She destroyed her husband. She has corrupted this one," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Eli. "And she will bring this whole town to ruin if you let her." It was those words, "a woman who destroys good men," that finally broke Anna's composure. It was the echo of her husband's voice, the core of the lie that had been used to cage her for years. She stood up, her movement so abrupt and forceful that her chair scraped loudly on the wooden floor. Every eye in the room turned to her. Her young lawyer tried to pull her back down, but she shook him off. "No," she said, her voice low and trembling, but carrying a new and terrifying strength. "I will not be silent anymore." She turned to face Reverend Miller. "You stand there and call me a destroyer. You, who never knew my husband. You only knew the man he pretended to be on Sundays." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "Let me tell you about the man of God I knew. I knew a man who measured his piety by the number of bruises on his wife's arms, hidden under her Sunday dress. I knew a man whose breath stank of whiskey while he wrote sermons about temptation. He did not control his temper. He called it righteous anger. He did not abuse his wife. He called it chastisement." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the timid, mysterious woman they had whispered about. This was a woman on fire with a truth that had been suppressed for too long. "You talk of the night he died," she continued, her voice rising, each word a hammer blow. "You did not see a marriage in that house. You saw a parsonage. That night, Gideon was not a man of God. He was a drunken, jealous rage. He screamed at me, accused me of shaming him, of tempting other men with a smile, with a song. He raised a lantern to strike me, and in his drunkenness, he fell. The lantern shattered. That is how your righteous fire started. Reverend." She was crying now, hot tears of rage and grief streaming down her face, but her voice did not falter. "The room was full of smoke. I could not breathe. He was on the floor, stunned. I tried to drag him out. I swear before the God you claim to serve. I tried, but he was too heavy, and the fire was everywhere. A beam fell. I ran from that house to save my life. Not because I was guilty. I ran because I had already buried one person I loved. I could not bear to be buried there with him." She sank back into her chair, her body trembling, the great terrible weight of her truth finally spoken. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The town had come for a spectacle, for the condemnation of a sinner. Instead, they had been forced to bear witness to a resurrection. The court was divided. You could see it on their faces. The women, some of whom bore their own hidden bruises, looked at Anna with a dawning horror and recognition. The men, who had been so quick to judge, now looked uneasy, their certainty shaken. Judge Hemlock cleared his throat, his gaze troubled. He looked from Anna's tear-streaked, defiant face to Miller's sputtering indignation. Eli stepped forward one last time. "Judge," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "For once, let justice in this town be about the truth, not about appearances. Let it be about what is right, not what is easy." The old judge stared at his hands for a long time. The whole town held its breath. When he finally looked up, his face was filled with a weariness that seemed to settle into the very foundations of the building. "The testimony in this matter," he said, his voice raspy, "is built on hearsay, rumor, and the testimony of a man who preaches hate better than he preaches the gospel." He glared at Miller. "There is no concrete evidence to support the charges of arson. The charge of murder is based on speculation. In the absence of proof, this court is left with only doubt." He banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. "The accused is acquitted of all charges. Case dismissed." A stunned silence, and then the room erupted in a cacophony of noise. Anna sat still, as if she had not heard. The words were too big, too impossible to comprehend. It was over. Reverend Miller, disgraced, would lose his pulpit within the week. Cortland, the bounty hunter, denied his prize and his reputation, slipped out of town before the sun set, a wraith of a man leaving in shame. Anna Whitley was a free woman, but she was not accepted. As she and Eli walked out of the town hall, the crowd parted for them. They did not cheer. They did not offer congratulations. They stared, their faces a mixture of pity, suspicion, and fear. She had been acquitted, but she was still a scandal. A woman who had aired the ugly secrets of a marriage. A woman who had survived. She was shunned. They walked back to the small cabin on the edge of town. the silence between them heavy with all that had happened. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Inside the cabin, Eli lit the lamp. He turned to face her. He looked at her, not as a project to be saved or a fugitive to be protected, but as the woman he had chosen. The woman who had stood in the face of the fire and refused to burn. "Anna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "This is my home, for what it is. I want you to share it with me. I want to give you my name. I want to give you my heart, if you will have it." She looked up at him, and her eyes, which had shown so much fire in the courtroom, were now filled with a deep, sorrowful vulnerability. A fresh wave of tears welled. "Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you are a good man, the best I have ever known. You deserve someone who is not broken. You deserve someone whole." He smiled, a sad, gentle smile. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her tear-stained cheeks. "Maybe I do," he said, his voice soft but sure. "But I want you instead." His words were the final stone being laid in a foundation she never thought she would have. She did not answer with a yes. She did not need to. She answered him by staying, by waking up in their small cabin the next morning and rekindling the fire in the hearth, a simple act that was the most profound vow she could make. The months that followed were a quiet, steady rhythm of healing. The harsh Wyoming winter loosened its grip, its retreat marked by the sound of dripping icicles and the slow greening of the hills. Spring came not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, determined force, turning the hard frozen earth into a promise of new life. Eli and Anna worked from sunup to sundown, their days measured in shared labor. They rebuilt the collapsed section of fence that bordered their property, the steady percussion of his hammer a counterpoint to the soft scrape of her shovel as she cleared stones for a garden. They did not speak much of the trial or the past. They did not have to. The memories were a part of their landscape now, like the jagged peaks of the mountains on the horizon. Always there, but no longer the entire view. Their conversations were about the practical things, the depth of a furrow, the chance of a late frost, the price of seed in town. But beneath the simple words, a deeper language was being spoken. When he brought her a cup of water in the field without her asking, it was an apology for all the times no one had cared for her. When she mended a tear in his shirt, it was a thank you for stitching her broken life back together. Their small cabin became a home. It was filled not with possessions, but with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, with the sight of his gun belt hanging next to her apron on a peg by the door. They were planting seeds, both in the dark, rich soil of her garden and in the quiet, fertile ground of their life together. Anna's reputation in Jericho Springs remained a complicated thing. The respectable folk, the ones who filled Reverend Miller's former church, still crossed the street to avoid her. They saw her as a walking scandal, a woman who had survived her own disgrace and in doing so had exposed the town's hypocrisy. But there was another Jericho Springs, the one that existed in the shadows of the saloons and the poorly built shacks by the creek. To these people, Anna Morgan was becoming something else entirely. It started with a woman named Sarah, the wife of a miner with a heavy hand and a thirst for whiskey. She appeared at their cabin one evening, her face a geography of old and new bruises, one eye swollen shut. She was terrified, expecting to be turned away. Instead, Anna brought her inside, sat her by the fire, and cleaned her wounds with a gentleness that brought the woman to tears. She did not ask questions. She simply gave her a bowl of stew and a safe place to sleep, just as Eli had once done for her. Eli, seeing the fear in the woman's eyes, took his bedroll and slept in the small barn without a word, giving them the house. News of this quiet act of mercy spread through the unseen channels of the town's outcasts. Soon, their cabin became a known sanctuary. A young woman cast out by her family for having a child out of wedlock found a week of peace there. A wife fleeing a mountain of her husband's gambling debts was given enough money for a stagecoach ticket and a new start. Anna was not just offering shelter. She was offering what had been denied her for so long: belief. She listened to their stories without judgment and saw not their shame, but their strength. She was repaying a debt to the man who had saved her by becoming a savior to others. One cool morning in late summer, Eli rose before dawn. He moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, packing a small bag with jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. Anna watched him from their bed, the faint light painting silver streaks in her hair. She knew where he was going. He had never spoken of it, but she felt the pull of his unfinished business, a ghost that still walked with him. "You will be careful," she said. It was not a question. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, his large, calloused hand covering hers. "Always," he said. He rode for 2 days, back to the land that had once been his family's, the place where his life had been irrevocably broken. The homestead was gone. The house burned down years ago by vagrants, the fields overgrown with weeds. But the big oak tree by the creek was still there, its branches reaching for the sky like skeletal arms, and beneath it, a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray, marked his brother's grave. Eli dismounted and walked to the spot, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He knelt and pulled the weeds from around the base of the cross, his movements slow and reverent. He had not been back here since the day he had ridden away. The rage in his heart, a wild, untamed fire. He sat there for a long time, the silence broken only by the rustle of the leaves and the gentle murmur of the creek, the same creek that had once run red with his brother's blood. He spoke to Samuel then, not with his voice, but with his heart. A long, silent conversation about the years that had passed, the men he had tracked, the justice he had sought in the barrel of a gun. He told him about Anna, about her courage, about the way she made him feel a sense of peace he had long believed was impossible. He spoke of the life they were building, a small, quiet thing, but more real and more precious than any revenge. Finally, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a deputy's star, given to him years ago in a different town, a town where he had briefly tried to be a part of the law before realizing he could not serve a master so easily corrupted. He had carried it with him ever since, a private symbol of the righteous path he had tried to walk, a constant reminder of the justice that had been denied. He polished the star on his sleeve, the metal gleaming faintly in the dappled sunlight. He looked at the name carved into the wooden cross: Samuel Morgan, beloved brother. "I am done chasing justice, Sammy," he whispered, his voice thick and raw. "I found something better." He gently pushed the pointed back of the star into the soft wood of the cross, embedding it there, a final, gleaming tribute. He stood, took one last look at the grave, and walked away without looking back. He had buried his vengeance in the same soil that held his brother. He was finally free. Their life was not without its shadows. Sometimes, Anna would wake in the night from a dream of fire and smoke, her body rigid with a terror that was no longer real. Eli would hold her, his steady presence a silent anchor, until the trembling stopped and her breathing evened out. And there were days when a profound melancholy would settle over her, a ghost of the grief for the child she had lost. On those days, Eli would not press her with questions. He would simply stay near, his quiet strength a reassurance that she was not alone in her sadness. He was learning that loving someone broken did not mean fixing them. It meant loving all of their pieces, even the sharp, shattered ones. The first snow of the season was falling when Reverend Miller returned to Jericho Springs. He did not come with the authority of the church behind him, but as a bitter, disgraced man, his spirit festering with a need for vindication. He did not preach from the pulpit. He preached on the street corner, in the saloon, in the general store, a snake whispering poison into the ears of anyone who would listen. He spoke of the blight upon the town, of the harlot who lived openly with her protector, of the sanctuary for sinners she kept. He tried to reignite the fear and hatred, to turn the town against the woman who had caused his downfall. The confrontation happened in front of the general store. Anna was leaving with a sack of flour, and Miller blocked her path. A small crowd of curious onlookers gathering around them. "There she is," Miller declared, his voice dripping with venom. "The woman who brought the devil to Jericho Springs. Have you no shame, madam? Will you burn this town down as you did your own home?" A year ago, even a few months ago, his words would have been a blade in her heart. She would have flinched, retreated, run. But now, she simply stood there, her gaze calm and steady. She looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with a kind of pity. She saw not a monster, but a small, sad man, consumed by his own hatred. She gave a small, sad smile. "Reverend," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold air, so that everyone could hear, "you can only burn what is flammable." She shifted the weight of the flour sack in her arms and looked him directly in the eye. "I am not anymore." It was a simple statement, but it was the most powerful sermon the town had ever heard. Before Miller could sputtering a reply, something remarkable happened. Sarah, the miner's wife, stepped out of the crowd and stood beside Anna. Then the young woman with the baby stood on her other side. Doc Abernathy came out of his office and stood behind them. One by one, the outcasts, the poor, the people Anna had helped, formed a silent, human wall around her. They did not shout or threaten. They just stood there, their presence a quiet, unshakable verdict. Reverend Miller looked at the wall of determined faces, at the people he had always dismissed as worthless, and he saw a power he could not defeat. He saw that his words had lost their fire, defeated. He turned and stalked away, the crowd parting for him in silent contempt. He was gone from Jericho Springs by nightfall, a man finally consumed by the poison he had tried to spread. That night, a deep, peaceful quiet settled over their cabin. The wind howled outside, and heavy snow fell, blanketing the world in a fresh, clean white. A large fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with a dancing, golden light. They lay together on a bearskin rug in front of it, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Anna rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She thought of the first time she had seen him, a tall, grim-faced stranger emerging from a blizzard. She thought of her own words, whispered from a body half frozen and a soul completely numb. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Do you remember what I said to you, that first day?" she whispered. He smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. "I remember everything about that day. I told you that you could warm me," she said, her voice soft with emotion. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rugged line of his jaw. "You did, Eli. You did warm me, but it was not your coat, or your fire, or your body." Her eyes held his, and in them, he saw the entirety of their journey. It was everything else. He pulled her closer, his arms a circle of safety and strength around her. He held her tight, his cheek resting against the top of her head. Outside, the snow fell thicker, and the wind howled its lonely winter song. But inside the small cabin, in the warm glow of the fire, they felt no cold. They had found their shelter, not in a place, but in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.